I've been asked to facilitate the program for today. We are going to start with soft issues today. We're going to deal with more of responsible gambling topics, harm minimization. And I'm not going to do this alone. I'm going to be assisted by my colleague for the first sessions, Paul from Australia, who is going to moderate the two sessions. Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce my moderator for the first session, which is Measuring and Reporting Gambling Harm and Responsible Gambling Doctrine, Mr. Paul Newson.
I think we're all aware that in most jurisdictions, if not all, gambling in some form or another is both legal and highly regulated. I know in Australia, in the last gambling prevalence survey, around 2012, over 60% of the adult population participates in some form of gambling activity. In another household survey, around 39% of the population participates regularly in some sort of gambling activity. But it's also recognised that gambling can cause harm. Excessive gambling absolutely causes harm. Where I think we do need to pause, and one of the reasons for these sessions this morning is, often there isn't clarity, there certainly isn't uniformity around what gambling harm means. At best, there's definitional elasticity. It means different things to different people. What we as regulators at least need to challenge is, what is a reasonable definition of gambling harm? Is it transient, inconsequential effects? Is it personal inconveniences? If you spend $100 here, you can't spend $100 there. Or is it more serious and severe than that? Needless to say, as was suggested by Fortune, it's gambling and mitigation activities, responsible gambling's a highly contested issue absolutely in Australia, and I'm sure universally. Just this morning, there was an announcement that under parliamentary privilege, an Australian parliamentarian made allegations that one of the major casino operators has been involved in tampering of gaming machines, has been undermining AML efforts, and has had a disregard for reports of domestic violence. That was just this morning. Earlier this week, the New South Wales government has been a defendant in litigation where a new entrant to the market is trying to introduce a product where we don't have a clear view on the lawfulness of that product. That's litigation that's been occurring this week. The New South Wales government last week made a media release that said it was concerned about the impacts of synthetic lotteries, and it would be taking advice, it would be considering options how to restrict synthetic lotteries operation in New South Wales. Needless to say, there's a lot of activity going on, certainly domestically in my jurisdiction, and I'm sure globally. It's a highly contested issue. The framework of responsible gambling is at least under scrutiny, and some argument is being made to challenge its efficacy. What I'd like to introduce now is Professor Del Fabro. He's going to speak to you about measuring gambling harm and some of the merits and disbenefits of the current approach. He'll then hand over to Professor Nerali Hing, who will talk about responsible gambling doctrine and its application.
Yes, thank you, Paul. So as Paul mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about gambling-related harm, which I think is a very important topic at the moment. So what I'll start by doing is talking a little bit about why harm is an important topic, and a little bit about how we've studied harm in the past. And generally, we haven't been all that good at studying harm. And so I'll talk about some of the recent research that's been conducted in the last few years in Australia, which I think provides much more clarity and refinement about how we measure harm. But having said that, there are a few words of caution about this new work. This new research, like any new research, there's always going to be bits which need improvement and refinement. And so while I'll be talking about the benefits of this new work, I'll also be talking about a few words of a caution just about how to interpret this work, because it is very easy for new findings to be taken by the media and different sort of media, different fora, and reported not quite the way that was intended. So I'll talk about some of that work. So why is harm important? Well, it's important for two reasons. First of all, it's very important it's central to clinical diagnosis. It's also central to public health approaches to the study of gambling and also responsible gambling. So what do I mean by clinical diagnosis? Well, when we diagnose something as a clinical disorder, like for example, we call pathological gambling, problem gambling, or disordered gambling are all terms we use to describe this disorder. We look for two things in a disorder. We look for statistically unusual behaviour, which is unusual in its intensity or frequency, or very unusual behaviours. But we don't usually talk about a clinical condition being present until we see evidence of harm. And so when you look at the DSM-5 for disordered gambling, you'll notice it's always contained evidence about harm. And in order to be a problem gambler, you not only have to spend a lot of time and money, you also need to incur significant harm, such as losing relationships or jobs, education, and of course, the previous version of the DSM even included criminal behaviour. So you think of any common everyday behaviours, you might have people who engage in weird behaviours, like having 20 cats in their house. You might say, that's pretty unusual. As we say in Australia, a person like that might be, one shorter six-pack, I think we say in Australia, isn't it? But you don't really talk about that as being a problem until it's causing their friends not to come around, or if their family's not turning up anymore, it's affecting their health and well-being. They're spending all their time and money doing this unusual behaviour. So that's why harm is very important in diagnosis. It's also very central to responsible gambling. Of course, responsible gambling, everything we're here about for this conference is about preventing harm. It's about harm minimisation in people who've already engaged in gambling. So regular gamblers, we already know, are engaged in the activity. It's about reducing any harm or minimising any harm that might incur when they gamble regularly. Harm reduction, most commonly exemplified in treatment services, is about reducing harm once it occurred. So responsible gambling is all about harm in some shape or form, however we conceptualise responsible gambling. It's of course central to public health approaches. Since the 1990s, we have framed problem gambling as a public health problem, which means we look at primary prevention, we look at education, we look at things that help prevent gambling problems from occurring. We also have secondary intervention, which try to help those who are already gambling in venues. And we have tertiary intervention, which are the treatment services, which we've always had. And you could probably argue we've been better at doing some of those things than others, as we'll probably talk about in the panel. Certainly, I think we've done quite well with treatment services, but have we done enough with secondary interventions? So what is harm? Well, it can be looked at in different ways. One way is the clinical sense. Does it lead to some functional impairments to your everyday functioning? And so a clinician who is treating a problem gambler will look for reductions in gambling symptomology, but also typically look for improvements in functioning, so that they might include measures of how you're doing at work, how you're doing psychologically, your social functioning. So we look for impairments in social functioning as evidence that gambling is affecting you. That's the form of harm we look at. Other studies, including the big Federal Productivity Commission report in Australia, talk about general impacts, negative impacts. And I'll talk about some of the different categories they use in a minute. So they simply talk about negative impacts, and that report, if you've read it, it's about this thick and it can keep your door open in a strong wind. It contains a detailed harm measure. It's one of the first studies that did, and it captures different negative impacts, personal, social and so on. More recently, people are now studying harm in terms of reductions in quality of life. To what extent does gambling impair your quality of life? And so we have definitions of what good quality of life means, and we can then look to what extent gambling reduces that quality of life. So that's three different ways harm can be looked at. And I think the bottom one is how we increasingly seen it being studied. Different forms of harm we're probably all familiar with. So the Federal Productivity Commission, in its big 1999 report, typically talks about harm as sort of extending out from the individual. You start with individual level harm, family harm, social harm, moving out to broader things such as impairment to your employment, vocation, education, and of course legal problems. And you can of course extend this further to look at community harms. You set up a new form of gambling, it might mean it affects a particular charitable form of gambling. We know about those sorts of impacts. We know about regional impacts. If gambling, for example, a new casino leads to the property prices going up, better development in an area, that's a regional impact. It could be a positive one, or it could be a negative one if you've got lots of sort of undesirables hanging outside, angry, Arsenal supporters or something hanging outside the casino after they've lost another match. Those sorts of things also need to be looked at. So how well has harm been captured in the past? Well, typically not all that well. Most of what we've known about harm in the past has come from prevalence studies, where we've asked people, have you lost a job? Have you lost a relationship because of gambling? Are you bankrupt? Have you spent some time at Her Majesty's pleasure as a result of gambling? And of course, the problem with those types of measures is the base rate or prevalence is very, very low. It's not that statistically useful. For regulators who need to sort of go back to the Minister and say, look, our intervention, our policy, our responsible gambling measures have made a difference, it's not much use if there's only about 3 people in the survey who've indicated or endorsed these items. So we look at the South Australian survey, for example, in 2012, where I come from. We only had 0.6 problem gamblers in the whole sample, and of those, only 0.4% changed the job. So we're talking about 2 or 3 people in the whole survey. It's not very useful data for regulatory planning. They'll look to see whether you've made much of a difference over time. We need more refined measures than this. They're still useful things to know, but they're not really that sensitive. We can get some data on harm from clinical samples. So, for example, clinical samples typically show quite high rates of harm. You'll typically find that 20% of people might report having committed crimes due to gambling, lots of relationship problems. But the trouble is the sorts of samples you get seeking help often have other problems. They have high comorbidity. The sort of people who come in for help often are different from the people out in the community. So they don't really tell you much about what's happening in the community. They're not a representative sample. And of course, they don't help you much with early prevention and wider responsible gambling measures because these people effectively have already got the problem and they've sought help. Another major problem is that the screening tools we're using to measure problem gambling, the most common, of course, is the Problem Gambling Severity Index. It doesn't really measure harm. So we have a national definition of problem gambling in Australia, which is all about harm, but we measure problem gambling using the PGSI, but really only 3, maybe 4 narrowly items really are about harm. It's not really a harm measure. But there have been some dedicated harm measures developed over the years. There's the Victorian Gambling Screen that was developed, the harm to self measure, and also Robert Williams and Rachel Volberg developed the PPGM measure in Canada, which separates out harm from behaviour. But the trouble is neither of these measures has been used very widely around the world, apart from those jurisdictions. So data isn't available for all of you guys who are doing the planning and responsible gambling work to see how harm is prevalent in the community. It's not being used very much. So what's needed is more refined and comprehensive assessments of harm, measuring harm right across the gambling continuum so we can pick up more nuanced changes if new responsible gambling measures, for example, are introduced. So recent harm research. Now, Neroli actually works with Matt Brown and a team who've done some of this work, so she's which is great. It's like a super group up there in Queensland now, yeah. It's like Jimmy Page coming to Led Zeppelin for the first time. It's a very good team up there. They've surveyed 3,000 gamblers in a panel survey, and even though it's not a representative sample of the community, they did get very high numbers of problem gamblers, moderate risk gamblers in their sample to look at different types of harm. And what they did was to measure harm in quite extensive lists of measures which range from very mild forms of harm to more serious ones. So, for example, a very serious gambling harm is being bankrupt. whereas a very mild form of gambling harm is simply reducing your expenditure on leisure activities. Work and study, you might lose a job or have reduced job performance. Health, you might be taken to the hospital, or you're just losing a bit of sleep, or you're a bit worried. End a relationship, or spend less time with family. So trying to capture the full continuum of different forms of harm. Now the important findings, the study showed that these measures seem to have some validity, in that when you look at problem gamblers, they certainly endorse quite a few of these items. For example, 7% were bankrupt. Still not that high, is it? Really. 11% had lost jobs, and 20% had relationship problems, where relationship had been threatened to end. And whereas low-risk gamblers rarely report serious harm. You can see it's almost zero for most of these serious forms of harm. So when you read in the media about low-risk gamblers having lots of harm, it's not the serious forms of harm. It's very, very low. Feeling worthless was the highest one. And many people feel worthless. If you feel worthless, you support certain football teams, as I said. It clearly shows that low-risk gamblers don't experience serious harms, but there is a difference between low-risk and high-risk gamblers on their endorsement of these items. The most common harms endorsed by low-risk gamblers were things like this: reducing their recreational expenditure that otherwise direct to other things, a bit less savings, being less physically active, feeling regret, well, you might have lost, I suppose, things like that were the most common reported harms by low-risk gamblers. Now, the first question this work raises straight away, if you're looking at it, there's many economists in the room probably saying this already, three of the main harms you see really associated with low-risk gambling do involve spending time and money gambling. And the question really arises, is this really a form of harm or a form of opportunity cost? So whenever you make a leisure choice, you have to choose, do I spend the money on this activity rather than this one? Going to the restaurant, going to the football, doing this or doing that. Is that really a form of harm? Anything you do, even going to the football, takes you away from your family. So is that really a harm or an opportunity cost? That's an important, this work does raise that question. Where do we draw the line between harm and opportunity cost? And I think that's one of the boundaries I think future research will try and set. The interesting work they did in this study was that they got each person to endorse or respond to this long survey. What they then did was feed back their responses in the form of a vignette. So for example, you might have something like this: your gambling is affecting your quality of life. You've reduced your spending on essential items, you're losing sleep, you're also neglecting relationships, because that person ticked those three boxes, those three items. What they then did to the person is said, this is quite clever, it's sort of this is how health economics type studies are done. What they did is they said, imagine you're faced with that set of harms for 10 years. How many years would you be willing to give up to be without that set of harms for the rest of the time? The person said 1 year, I give up 1 year to be free of those harms. They would say that you've got 1 year of lost quality of life. So that's how they do this type of analysis. What you can then, of course, do is add up all the lost quality of life for low-risk gamblers, moderate-risk gamblers, and high-risk gamblers. This is how they do this type of work. So a low-risk vignette might look like this. You're less spending money, have reduced your savings. Now, once again, this is where I sort of raise a little question. This is where probably the research is going to make it more refined. I do raise a question that by having the wording, your gambling is affecting your quality of life, prefacing each of the statements, it does sort of possibly prime people into thinking these are more of a problem than they might otherwise be. A question does arise as to whether, if you rewrote those harms in the following way, you'll continue to spend your savings and money on gambling for the next 10 years rather than on going to football. Would people necessarily say, I'll give up a year of that? Well, I necessarily regard that as a form of harm. And see, it may be to do with how the question is worded. I'm being a little bit unfair here in the sense I'm targeting a particular one question which I think is potentially problematic, but many others in that survey I think weren't. I think they're good. But it just raised some questions about opportunity cost, whether we're remeasuring harm, that type of question. Anyway, the particular finding that they made in the study was that if you took all the years of lost years from the low-risk gamblers and you start adding them up, a bit like little kids' blocks. You start putting on top of one another, 1 year, 1 year, 1 year. And what they found, because there are lots and lots of low-risk gamblers out there, lots more low-risk gamblers than high-risk gamblers, the burden of harm came out higher for the low-risk gamblers than the other two groups. In fact, they argued the burden of lost years for low-risk gambling is higher than osteoarthritis, problem gambling and diabetes, which is quite a surprising and counterintuitive finding. It may be correct, it may not be, but this is what their work suggests, and that's why I think it's very sort of interesting, exciting research, but it does, raise some questions about, validity, but this is how research progresses. The other issue which it touches upon is the logic we see in public health what's called the prevention paradox. Prevention paradox, essentially, even though Matt Brown's team didn't specifically investigate this specifically, prevention paradox essentially states that in many common disorders, the burden of harm is greater in the low-risk cases. And this works very well for things like asthma, where you've got very few people who experience asthma to the extent that they'll have a fatal asthma attack. But there's lots of kids out there, people like me, who get occasional exertion asthma. And with millions of us, so when you multiply our small blocks of harm by the millions of us, the burden from low-risk asthma probably is greater than the very, very rare severe cases. And so there is a public health argument to focus upon the low-risk cases to make sure they don't progress to more serious forms of harm. But applying this to gambling, of course, is perhaps more challenging. My concerns about the prevention paradox logic is that, is that harm here is a form of sort of, it's like a liquid quality. You sort of harvest off bits of harm from individuals, and then you sort of put it into a great big sort of bucket, and you measure it. It doesn't necessarily mean, and even though that bucket might be bigger for the low-risk gamblers, it doesn't necessarily mean that any of those low-risk gamblers experience any significant harm individually. And as Matt Brown would say, look, that's the nature of the methodology. This is what we're trying to do, measuring harm rather than necessarily just individuals, counting individuals. But the point is the media, when they read this, often don't know the difference. They'll misreport it. The other issue which this stuff raises is that it does provide a common rubric or method for comparing the impact of different types of harm. But sometimes you have to wonder, is it mixing up apples with oranges? That is, are you sort of putting things together which are quite different? The crude analogy I sort of draw is that imagine if you've got sort of 50 people here in the room who've got a very slight tickle in the nose. And I was to ask you, how much discomfort out of 10 does that you experience? And you say, well, not much. 1 out of 10. 50 times 1 equals 50 units of harm. You've got then, say, 3 or 4 people who are so sick they can't attend this morning, they're home with the flu, or they had a big night last night. 8 out of 10, they're really not feeling well. 24 units of harm. You're really going to tell me that 50 is greater than the 24. And this is one of the sort of challenges, I think, of this type of logic. They're quite different things. So can you compare the additive effect of very minor forms of harm with genuine, more serious harm? That's one of the challenges, I think, of this methodology. You see this with gambling, for example. If you had 30 people who are bankrupt, and they said, yes, I'd be willing to give up 8 years not to be bankrupt, that's 240 years of lost life, versus 300 people who lost 1 year due to having reduced savings is really 300 greater than 240. And that's the other conceptual thing. So harm has a sort of liquid quantity. No one really needs to be harmed to the point that their functioning is affected. You're simply harvesting off bits of harm in its own right. And so how many people, low-risk gamblers, are actually genuinely harmed to the point that you might say that their psychological, social and physical health is affected? And Matt would be the first to admit this is the nature of the work. It's about harm, not necessarily individuals, but in the reporting of it and the interpretation of it, the distinction may be lost. The concern is that this type of logic may be extended to prevalence studies, and I have already seen this in papers I've been sent to review. Typically, when we do a prevalence study, we administer the PGSI, and people score 8 or more out of 27 in order to get classified as a problem gambler. And usually about 0.5% of the population, or 1%, will be classified as problem gamblers. What I'm seeing people do now is they say, well, hang on, we've got these people who score 1 on the PGSI. And because there's lots of them, they're harmed people, who've got 1 score on the PGSI, there's more burden of harm in people who score 1 on the PGSI. The actual prevalence rate is actually not 0.5% of the population, but in fact about 5%, because lots of people will endorse at least one item on the PGSI or other scales we administer. And so there is concern about this type of logic being used to creep the prevalence rate, which is not going to be much fun for regulators. Suddenly who the minister says, now hang on, you've got a prevalence rate of about 1% last time, now it's 5%, please explain. The regulatory pros and cons. Well, the pros of this new work, of course, is it does give us a focus upon low-risk gambling and prevention, which is very central to responsible gambling. Disadvantage is that it could lead to an argument of over-regulation of low-risk populations. Most low-risk gamblers are recreational gamblers by definition. Do we really want to be over-regulating their behaviour on this logic? So how can this research be improved? Well, what's coming next? Well, I think one of the things, for example, if many of you have read Matt Rocklov's work, and Matt's sort of doing some interesting work, very similar to what Richard Wood in Canada's doing, John Park in the UK. They're focusing more upon positive items. So low-risk gamblers also tend to be the sort of gamblers who are most likely to report the benefits from gambling. They're the ones who are most likely to enjoy going out and having just a social drink. They often socialise and they gamble. Even some research showing that elderly people will go out and socialise and gamble because it's available. And so benefits are probably most concentrated in the low-risk groups. And so there was an argument, maybe we need to look at the sort of trade-off between benefit and cost. At what point does the benefit of recreational gambling get exceeded by the cost? And that's an interesting sort of line of research. The very important thing, I think, is clarity. There's nothing wrong with this research, I think, and the methodology which I think has been used. It's a World Health Organization endorsed approach. As I said, I've got concerns about some aspects of it, but the main thing is that in the reporting of this type of and interpretation of these findings, that two things are not confused. The first is that the prevalence of people who report at least one little harm is always going to be much larger than the prevalence of people who are actually harmed to the point that they've got impairments to their functioning. Now, when you see reporting in the media, that distinction will not be drawn. What will happen, you do a study when you have talk about lots of burden of harm and low-risk gamblers. The headline will be low-risk gamblers, low-risk gambling is the source of all harm for gambling. You can sort of see the headline. So it's very important that these two things are not confused, because it's ultimately individuals who seek help, not blobs of harm, which may be conceptually useful in sort of public health to understand, but it's about how many people are harmed to the point they need to seek professional assistance, that we really need prevalence studies to help plan services. So future methodologies, I think, will probably focus upon this trade-harm-benefit trade-off. When does gambling no longer become enjoyable for you? When does the cost exceed the harm? And I think possibly looking at thresholds for harm. As Alex Brzezinski said last year at the European conference, lots of minor harms, loss of savings, all those sorts of things, while not in their own right probably not major forms of harm, they can cumulatively undermine your quality of life. And you've seen it in a lot of his clinical clients. And so at what threshold do minor harms contribute to a loss of quality of life? I think that's another very important question we can look at, and that's probably work which I think the team is probably going to look at in the future. Anyway, thank you. I hope that all made sense, and over to Neroli.
The conversation in Australia, it's migrating. There is a level of dissatisfaction. I don't think we're at the tipping point yet, but there is a level of dissatisfaction with the Reno model. Some commentators are asking, or some commentators are alleging that it is more than fallible, that it provides too much comfort for industry, that it distracts policy and distracts regulators from intervening where they ought. It tips the focus too much on the individual and individual behaviours. That's what some commentators are increasingly arguing in Australian jurisdictions. So what you might find, if you accept that argument, is what Paul explained around harvesting or scooping up all of these harms and then having a dialogue which says problem gambling prevalence isn't 0.8, it's 5, 10 or 15% of your population. I think we'd all acknowledge that would cause a fairly abrupt and probably draconian intervention from government. We'll now have Professor Neroli Hing speak to what is the Reno model, what are the principles of responsible gambling, and what does it look like?
Okay, well, look, thank you, first of all, to the conference organisers for providing this opportunity to talk to you or with you today, and a particular thanks also to New South Wales Liquor, Gaming and Racing for hosting my visit over here. I want to share with you today some reflections on responsible gambling. Just as some background, I've been researching gambling for about 20 or over 20 years now, particularly in areas including responsible gambling, problem gambling, consumer behaviour in gambling, and more recently internet gambling and sports betting, as well as harm minimisation and lots of other areas. Okay, so let's think about, cast our minds back to about 20 years ago. That is, those of you who were born then, or at least out of nappies at that time. So I think it's safe to say that, you know, back in the mid-1990s, there was just no such thing really as responsible gambling. So it was just not in the lexicon at all. So there was certainly awareness that some people become addicted to gambling, but problem gambling or pathological gambling, compulsive gambling as it tended to be called, was seen very much as a psychological disorder and an issue to be dealt with not by regulation but by the medical profession. So, you know, people who had a gambling problem should go and see a psychologist or a psychiatrist and seek treatment. So gambling and gambling problems and gambling related harm was certainly not viewed as a public health issue. So there wasn't consideration in those days particularly for how gambling might impact on the broader population, apart from this very small percentage of people who would be diagnosable with a serious gambling disorder. There was certainly opposition to gambling in some quarters, but that opposition tended to be framed not so much in terms of the social impacts of gambling, but in terms of moral arguments against gambling, that it was a bad thing, that it, you know, perhaps undermined the work ethic, and of course concerns for criminal activity linked to gambling. So I think it's fair to say that you know, regulation was focused, amongst other things, on making sure that the gambling product had integrity and was free from criminal influence. In the late 1990s then, we certainly saw a wave of gambling expansion. We saw gambling policy, particularly in Australia, but not just there, in Northern America, Canada and the US, and also in New Zealand, a little bit later in the UK, certainly start to focus on market stimulation and industry expansion, competition and privatisation. And this was a big change that happened in the late 1990s from previous times when gambling had not, you know, had been generally come from, been run very much by governments and charitable and non-profit organisations. So, you know, over the late 1990s, we certainly saw a lot of industry expansion. And at that stage, industry was either defensive or at best reluctant about having any corporate social responsibilities in gambling. And regulation really wasn't focused on responsible gambling. It was not even in the lexicon, except to try and prevent, or to have safeguards to prevent minors, people under 18, from engaging and accessing gambling products. And needless to say, there was very little research in that space as well. However, by the late 1990s, and certainly in Australia, but also elsewhere, the seeds of discontent had been sown about expansionist gambling policies that had increased, and what some saw to be quite aggressive and exploitative industry practices, and problem gambling and the social impacts of gambling had sort of become much more visible in society. And problem gambling was starting to be recognised as causing not just harm to the individual. Harm minimisation and consumer protection are often explicit objectives these days in gambling policy. Operators accept that they have a responsibility to provide gambling in a safe or safer manner, and RGs typically integrated into their strategies and structures and practices. And we try to also encourage consumers to consume, or gamblers to consume gambling in a responsible manner as well. And we try to assist that through information, public education and various tools to help them to stay in control. So what is responsible gambling? Well, as Paul mentioned before, it's very much a contested concept. There's certainly a group of researchers out there who would say no such thing as responsible gambling, it's an oxymoron. That's one view. It's not one that I necessarily subscribe to, but that view is out there. I would say, though, that there is definitely no accepted definition of RG, and there's a lot of or substantial ambiguity amongst stakeholders about what RG actually is, where does it start and stop, what does it really mean. Nonetheless, we have the situation, though, where RG actually underpins the vast majority of government, industry and public health efforts to do something about gambling-related harm. But is it about preventing or minimising or reducing that harm from gambling? And I would agree with Paul's observation that most efforts to date, well, we've done better at the pointy end of the spectrum in terms of reducing existing cases of gambling harm amongst problem gamblers than we have done about preventing gambling harm, for example. Okay, so I think after 20 years of RG, it's probably fair to ask the question, are we there yet? And my response to that would be, well, we've come a long way, but no, I don't think we're there yet, and I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And I guess to share some fairly obvious signs that we're not there yet with you, I've just pulled out a few dot points there. So we know that substantial gambling revenues still come from people who would be diagnosed as having a gambling problem. So the Productivity Commission in 2010 in Australia put that figure of 40% of electronic gaming machine revenue in Australia coming from problem gamblers. Wood and Williams in Ontario put that figure at 61%. I think they're pretty alarming figures in anyone's book. As Paul's been discussing, there's substantial harm from moderate risk and low risk gambling. We can argue about whether it's, the figure that Matt Brown and colleagues came up with or measured and presented was that 85% of the aggregate harm from gambling actually comes from low risk and moderate risk gambling. But I think that one of the things that report has certainly done is drawn attention to substantial harm from gambling that's not just confined to problem gambling, and we need to be thinking about harm that arises from lower levels of gambling involvement. I would raise a point too that as we've had new products and modes of gambling emerging, so I'm thinking internet gambling, sports betting, online sports betting, we've seen new groups of problem gamblers emerge as well. So we haven't solved this problem. We're seeing, certainly in Australia and elsewhere, young adult males, for example, increasingly presenting to gambling help services with problems in controlling their sports betting. So we're not doing, a completely successful job at prevention, clearly. And we also see vulnerable groups in the community who are experiencing gambling problems at alarming rates and whose harms appear to be worsening with, I would say, not a lot of policy response to it or industry response to it. What they refer to, I led some work a few years back on gambling amongst our Aboriginal peoples in Australia. The results from measuring gambling, administering the PGSI amongst various Aboriginal communities in Australia. And you'll see from those figures that a sizable proportion of the people in our surveys, and I hasten to add that these weren't representative surveys. Aboriginal peoples only make up 2 or 3% of Australia's population, so it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to get representative surveys. But we've done a number of surveys in a number of communities now. So around 40% are non-gamblers. But you'll see from looking at the other graph there that amongst the gamblers, about 25% were non-problem gamblers, 28% were low-risk gamblers, 21% were moderate-risk gamblers, and 25% were problem gamblers. So the distribution of gambling problems is very different in our Indigenous communities in Australia, and there's very similar work and similar results have come out of Canada and other parts of North America as well. And I would argue that we haven't been particularly successful at tackling, what is a very serious problem. Anyway, I won't labour that point too much more. Okay, some more signs I think that we're not there yet. We know that impaired control amongst regular gamblers on electronic gaming machines is pretty common, and we know that EGMs are the source of most of gambling problems in most societies where they're legal, but we haven't seen a lot of reform, particularly in EGM game design. We still have machines where you can bet a lot of money or lose a lot of money very quickly. We have, certainly in Australia, have witnessed community complaints about advertising around gambling, particularly around wagering, online wagering. So online sports betting, sort of the new kid on the block, if you like, in Australia. And there's been a lot of community concern about the level of advertising, and particularly the exposure of children to that advertising. And the federal government has now moved to restrict advertising of online wagering during general viewing time on television. So that's a good sign. We've also seen concern about significant inducements and promotions around online wagering that can undermine responsible gambling. Things like the extension of credit to punters to bet with. Again, the federal governments are moving on that particular issue. But we did a study of wagering inducements. Was it last year? The year before. For those of you who are interested, you can see me later for the details for that. But some of those inducements certainly would appear to act to, or have potential to encourage heavier betting and riskier betting and impulsive betting as well. We've also seen some evidence-based reforms not implemented. So the Productivity Commission inquiry in 2010 came up with a vast number of recommendations to improve responsible gambling and to lower gambling harm and lower gambling problems. But we've seen a lot of those recommendations not implemented. And I would argue that we're still very much focused on problem gambling rather than harm to public health. Okay, so on a more positive note, now I've probably made myself really unpopular by pointing out lots of gaps that I see. What are some ways forward? How can we move forward to improve RG? Well, if we want to get there, we need to know where there is. So what are the objectives of RG? We need to know what principles and objectives we're aiming for. I think it was Dan Moore yesterday talked about, we need honest and clear objectives in gambling policy. And then we need, of course, to align policy and regulations to those objectives and industry practices as well. And we need also to be promoting evidence-based safe gambling practices for consumers and to measure our progress in getting where we want to go. And I just want to talk to each of those points a little bit further. So what are the objectives of RG policies and practices, or probably what should they be? Well, it's not just about reducing the numbers of problem gamblers. It really is about, as Paul mentioned, preventing and minimising and reducing gambling-related harm. Problem gambling and gambling harm are not the same thing, although this is a very popular and perpetuated view. I didn't realise I was supposed to talk about the Reno model in my talk, but
Anyway, kia ora tātou to you all, and that's just a very brief Maori greeting. Unlike Australia, New Zealand does not have a federal system, so we're a unicameral political system, and so it's much easier in New Zealand for legislative initiatives to be implemented. The Gambling Commission that I chair, and I'm fortunate to be joined at this conference by Lisa Hanson, who's also a commissioner, and a Wellington barrister, who is one of our commissioners, obviously. We are established under a piece of legislation called, not unremarkably, the Gambling Act 2003. And I mention that because it replaced a piece of legislation which was called the Casino Control Authority Act in 2003. That distinction is quite important because under the previous legislation, the purpose of the legislation was to promote tourism and employment, whereas the purpose of the new legislation is to promote safety and with particular emphasis on harm minimisation. So it's quite a different focus, and part of the work of the Commission over the several years that I've been involved has been in trying to really change the culture of the industry. And our industry in New Zealand is comprised of casinos. We have basically charitable societies, a plethora of them, who have gaming machines, and they work through venues, which are pubs and clubs, to then, with the mandate to provide the profits that they make, if I could use that terrible term, to the community for community benefit. So we have the casino, we have the pubs and clubs where the majority of the machines are, and we then have the lotto, and we have the New Zealand Racing Board, which is the TAB, which deals with horse racing and sports betting. The TAB in that matrix is the only organisation that has a monopoly position, and they fight fearlessly to preserve it. So that's the structure of the industry. We have, as far as the Commission is concerned, and under the legislation, one of the important functions that we have is that our legislation also prescribes that we have a public health focus. And this industry is required to suffer every 3 years what we call the levy round. And the levy round is a process whereby the Ministry of Health sets out a 3-year strategic plan, and it says, for example, over the next 3 years we need $60 million or $58 million, whatever it might be, but it's in that vicinity, just that I'm not plucking a number out of the air, to manage the task that we have. And that task is to fund service providers, so all of the service providers in New Zealand treatment providers, that is, for problem gambling, are funded out of this fund under contract to the Ministry of Health. They also have a responsibility to fund research. No doubt my colleagues to my left will be delighted to hear that. And they also have the responsibility via an advertising agency which is run by the Health Department to put together promotional materials somewhat similar to the Norwegian ones that we saw yesterday, although except for the first one, we probably wouldn't get away with that one in New Zealand. But so there is that, if you like, at that macro level, all of those things working. At the micro level, then, we have very much similar indicators and so on that my Australian colleagues have already referred to, and I don't pretend, well, I won't now go through those again in detail because no doubt my 3 minutes is nearly up. But I just want to make the point, though, that one of the questions we were asked to say was, well, what do you think is best practice? And I was going to say, well, I genuinely thought until this morning that our policy documents that we have, including identification programs, which, by the way, we were assisted very ably by Paul Grafalbro to put together. We certainly believe still, despite this morning's session, that they are of best practice value, and we're very happy with the assistance that Paul has given us over the years. So thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, and I look forward to your questions as we move on.
I will take a European perspective. I've put down some questions on research, on the necessity to have research. I don't know if they're on yet. because I want to stress the need for international cooperation on research on problem gambling. I would like to compliment Professor Hing and Professor Del Fabio on their presentation. I found it very interesting and learned a lot, as we all did, I hear. And I appreciate the reflection on what responsible gambling is and what it isn't. And with that being said, it is clear also from the presentations, but I experience that every day, that we don't know very well which approaches to take, which protective measures to take, what is most effective in tackling harmful play and problem gambling. And all research that is being done is still limited in scope, we notice. I believe that measures and approaches on problem gambling should be grounded on empirical evidence. Further understanding is needed of both the causes, prevention, treatment and implications of problem gambling and gambling-related harm. And I see that a lot of us agree with that they are not, what I see is that we are not yet exchanging information from jurisdiction to jurisdiction about the research being done, and that of course could have the effect that we all reinvent the wheel. So what I would argue, and I hope that everybody agrees with me, and the next question on Slido will be about that we need to work together at an international level for further research in this domain.
Venue approach a person they think has been at a machine or displaying behaviour or conduct which seems aggravated, seems that they might be excessive in their behaviours. Does that actually happen? And if it does, is it good practice? We're increasingly in a data-rich environment. Is there opportunity for industry to better harness, to better tackle and interrogate the rich data they have on their customers to have more meaningful, to have more proactive, responsible gambling initiatives? Now, I'll start with Susan for some brief comments or observations.
Thanks, Paul. Look, I think the answer is yes. I think if we don't explore it, it's a bit of a missed opportunity. Venues have a lot of data with these systems that they're using clearly for marketing purposes, and I think they know who their patrons are that are the big spenders, and spend a lot of time there. But that doesn't necessarily reflect that these people have got a problem as well. And I think with a bit of interrogation and investigation about what we can get from these systems, including investigating maybe what algorithms might look like, we can then start to look at potentially problematic patterns of behaviour, and a venue can use that to decide, with the right tools and education, how they may intervene, whether that might be some dynamic messages that come up on a gaming machine, perhaps using the nudge theory, or it could be going and having some human intervention and slapping someone on the back and saying, how you going? Just showing a bit of consideration there. I think venues have a duty of care to their patrons, and if we can harness the data that they're already collecting and use it from a responsible gambling standpoint, I think it's only going to benefit the community.
Thanks, Susan. Look, I'll go out on a limb and make a bold statement that industry may not move at the sort of pace, may not expedite these sort of things where regulators or where government may want them to. So they may well need a little bit of encouragement to realise that untapped value from the data they have. They certainly utilise it for their rewards programs and their incentives. Let's see if we can tip it a little bit and get more smarter, more intelligent, responsible gambling. So we've got a few minutes left. There's one question on the screen that I'd certainly like us to tackle. It says, when we speak about reducing or minimising harm, have we considered casino design, the footprint, the layout? It just moved. Casinos are physically designed to keep players in dim lighting, few mirrors, no clocks. Should we regulate more? That's a cracker of a question. Look, let me throw that to the panel. Who'd like to speak on that one? Susan?
Can I open up? Because it's quite funny. It's relevant because my 11-year-old son was listening to the radio the other day, and he happened to hear a story about environmental factors by the sounds of it, and he happened to mention saying, hey mum, they make casinos with really low ceilings and dark, so you spend more. And that got me then thinking whether or not we should be looking at some minimum standards that might be reflective of a responsible venue in how they design that venue from a responsible gambling standpoint. Whether it's not, better lighting or not allowing people to sit on their own in that dark corner.
Yes.
Yeah.
Look, I want to throw to one of the researchers here and put them on the spot. And is this something that's being explored currently, or
Yeah.
what have you got to say?
There's a researcher over in Canada, I think Karen Finlay, has done quite a few papers about 3 or 4 conferences in a row I went to. She's published quite a few papers on looking at the playground casino versus, I forget the name of the second one now off the top of my head, but Karen's done work with simulations of different types of casino environment and getting people to actually gamble and looking at its effects on people's behaviour. So there is actually research out there that's looked at it. The issue of clocks and so on has been discussed in Australia. It's always been one of those urban myths about whether having a clock in the venue makes a difference, because it tries to tap into the idea of increasing reality checking. I think the general conclusion is that it's a good idea. No evidence will make a huge amount of difference. I think what we really need to talk about is something which actually just makes people take more frequent breaks. So if a clock might be one feature you need to have, but also having something which makes people move out of the venue, have to go and actually have a human interaction with someone, all those sorts of things that give people a reality check. So however you do the reality check, the reality check is the important thing, but how you achieve it, it might be several different ways you can do it. The clock's only one part of it, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Maria or Andre, do you want to speak to that? Or Graham?
Yeah, I may be a little bit controversial, yeah, but I am worried about getting too carried away with these sort of things, because do we have evidence to suggest that that is going to solve the problem? Are we not running the risk by introducing and regulators having to legislate for introducing fluorescent lighting in all of the casinos, that we really spoil the whole experience for those that do not necessarily have that problem? I'm really concerned if one goes down a particular avenue trying to deal with something. I mean, it's important to remember that identifying risk markers is only part of the battle, isn't it? The intervention process, I mean, that is the difficult part to get right. And we shouldn't jump in there with a big splash before we don't really know that is the way to deal with a problem.
Now, I want to take a few more comments on this. Paul's champing at the bit as a bit of a rebuttal, maybe.
A number of years ago, Bob Ladouceur did a study where he wanted to see how people gamble when you just pare down the environment to just its bare essentials. It's a bit like in Australia where we had the plain packaging for cigarettes, the death cigarettes. They look absolutely horrible. And you can guess who are the people who still smoked and guess which are the people who still gambled. It's the problem gamblers. In other words, when you boil it down and take out all the enjoyment features just down to the bare bones, it's the people who are hardcore gamblers and smokers who still do it. So like you, I'm not convinced that taking out... I think reality checks are important, but taking out all the fun features won't necessarily solve problem gambling, no.
Maria?
Well, I would just say... Oh, sorry. Beg your pardon, I'm so rude. I would just say that breaks in play seem to be accepted as a method of assisting people who are maybe experiencing difficulties at the machine. But there are many ways of doing that, and we have a number of them in New Zealand as well. But I personally would feel too that instructing or directing, under the theory, nudge theory, operators to have a certain level of lighting in their properties and all the rest of it. We are, after all, dealing with people's private property here, and I think we need to be cautious. And I'm sort of more in Andre's camp, I think, on this one, and certainly assisted by Paul's scientific research.
Thanks, Graham. Maria?
More or less, I think what I mentioned is the same, but what I also notice, and I've been a researcher myself for a short time, and I know that it happens everywhere, but if you put researchers together in one room and you ask, should we do it this way, should we do it that way, or not at all, they don't agree with each other. And that says something about scope and of knowledge that we have already. So I think we need more evidence, and until we have the evidence, we need to have also focus on an attractive environment for gambling, because we want to keep them in the legal setting, of course. So
there's some questions on there about New South Wales, which I'd be more than happy to speak to individuals about as to what our practices are at a later time. I said at the outset, this was a richly diverse panel. We probably didn't squeeze as much value out of it. We could have had another 1 or 2 hours of everybody having a contribution, and I certainly would have really enjoyed that. But we've hit up against our time. Please join me in thanking these panel members for their contributions.
Thank you very much. Let's give Paul another round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce a gentleman who's familiar to most of you, Mr. Atle Hammer, from the Norwegian Gaming and Foundation Authority. He's the director of that association. He's one of the ex-directors or former directors, trustees of the Board of Trustees of EAGRA. When we were wrapping up, you had questions saying, do we have to change the layout and the designs of the casinos? And there was a question that I thought we'll get to talk to, which was saying, in as much as we're dealing with problem gambling and harm minimization in general, do we now have to be specific and deal with the types of the games offered in trying to address the challenges that we have around problem gambling and harm minimization? Atle, you have a difficult one because there's a revenue to be generated, and at the same time, there's the responsible gambling that has to be carried through as I think an indictment of government, operators, and the communities where these casinos operate. Over to you. These are your areas.
Thank you very much, Fortune, for that introduction. And yes, I think I will, through my presentation, cross into those questions you mentioned about how should you create a revenue which is important for many. If we start with the consumers, well, we are now 17 years into the new millennium. And as I said yesterday, we have been on several discussions where we have discussed the millennials, the changed patterns in behavior, the changing in values they have. And if we connect this with research, and what we know from research is, for example, that Cone Communication presented a survey saying that 84% of global consumers also said they would seek out responsible products whenever possible. And corporate social responsibility is a model of business which is heavily rooted in responsible ethics. Today, consumers look for more than just a material product. Well, probably not every consumer, but the younger ones, they are going in to that direction. But 9 out of 10 expect that companies take a social responsibility, including both social and environmental issues. And we may see that in all the elections which has been now held around the world, and especially in Europe, that when parties decrease, some parties win because they talk more about social and environmental values. Is this a Norwegian example? No. I think this is quite a global example. If we look at several industries, you would find those facts out of research. Some of you may remember a very good British folk rock band back from the 70s called Fairport Convention. You remember Fairport Convention, anyone? Sandy Denny, the great vocal. Linda, you're too young. You're born at that age. She had a song, Nick, called The North Star and the Grassman. And if you are like Sandy Denny, if you behave like Sandy Denny sings in her song, take the boat and sails from the south of Africa towards Norway in the north, you will also find the northern lights in the end if you follow the northern star. And I remember back from Oslo in 2013 that was the way. That was something you wanted to discover, the northern lights, and I don't know if you managed to discover that, because I said you had to go really far north if you should discover that at that time of year. But if we go back to the gambling market, apologize for a little bit old figures, but I think the trend is quite clear. As you see, no dramatic changes. But the landscape market changed until 2000, grew until the big financial crisis hit us all in 2008. But there's a considerable growth in online gambling market, a growth we expect will continue even if more and more European countries decide to open their markets. And let's look about how Europe is doing. Anne-Mette showed this yesterday. This is a map with broadband access, and broadband access and high capacity mobile broadband access is very important to offer online gaming and gambling products. Many European countries, there are many European countries, and there are such as many regulations as there are countries, because Europe has no common EU regulation. So each country, they have their own law with their own gaming and gambling regulation. So it's a variety of regulatory frameworks. And the EU has not so far come up with a common gambling legislation, and nobody knows for sure if there will be a common EU gambling in the future. And many European countries hang on to their monopoly regulatory model for central parts of their gambling market, like number games, sports betting, and horse race betting. So when we talk about a licensed market in Europe in many countries, well, a big part of each country's market in Europe is organized like a monopoly as far as lotto, number games, horse betting is very much a local thing. And then you have the online games, which is online casino games and live betting, and in Europe very much live soccer betting. So this is how Europe goes, and many countries today have a discussion also to open more up for central parts of their gambling market to license foreign gambling operators. So interactive gambling is growing, and we see more games that combine elements from gambling with computer games and social games. And that's also a new trend. You include those computer games and social games, things like skins, virtual values, fantasy sport, and all the things you know from computer games back from the 90s and into the new millennium. So it's interesting times. And are we going to Norway? We have a straight-through monopoly. In Norway, we have recently worked our way through the current regulation. We looked at all available options for the regulation of gambling in order to obtain the safest gambling regulation for the Norwegian population. And yes, we also looked into how would a license model in Norway work according to a monopoly model that we have today. This job concluded with a white paper which was presented for the Ministry of Culture's advice to the Parliament. And the Ministry stated that the safest regulatory environment for the Norwegian citizens still is the gambling monopoly. So it's a prerequisite for our regulatory model that we balance attractive games with responsibility. And this also follows from EU regulation, and I'll try to explain this. If Norway is going to keep its monopoly for the coming years, we need to prove, according to the EU law, that our gaming model is more a social responsible model than a gaming industry licensed model. That's what the regulation needs to prove if our case should be proved in the EU court. So that is the framework we as regulators work inside. And then Norsk Tipping, as I will show, offer online casino games, and they offer live betting, and in Norway, live soccer betting at most. So the purpose of the Norwegian regulatory model is to ensure that gambling is offered in satisfactory forms under public control, aiming to prevent negative social consequences such as problem gambling. At the same time, the model also ensures that gambling can be a good source for revenue for good causes, such as social useful organization, humanitarian work, sport association, and culture. Visually, this can be seen as driving a fast car without putting on your seatbelt. Most times you drive without a seatbelt, all ends well. But once in a while, this is not the case. So, responsibility is the regulator's primary number one, according to how I said we have to prove this according to the EU law. Money to good causes will always be second. So we have 100% registered play. To enable the operator to offer safe games for the player, the operator can offer the games to identified players only. So, Fortune, you cannot use my gaming ID in Norway if you want a game. You need to have your own unique, secure login ID. And it is cashless. And you know, I'm wondering, why is this sector, as the only left sector in the world, dealing with that big amount of cash? Do any of you reflect of that? Do any of us use cash in that amount in other parts of our life? No. So also, this sector has to go digital. The Norwegian market for lotteries and money games, and I'm not trying to circle in how the balance will be between social responsible framework and money games. If you see the whole cake here, the Norwegian market, you see the light green one, that's the unregulated market, the leak to foreign operators outside. So if you look at the whole market, they have not a big percentage up to date. But if you take the blue part of the cake, which is Norsk Tipping's online casino games and live betting games, and compare with the green part of the cake, you would see that they are almost 50-50. Unregulated operators, they have a little bit more market share of those two categories of gaming. So that's where the competition is in Norway. So if we are going to talk about business models, here we have the traditional business model as far as we talk about online gambling. And here is the traditional way of thinking. Responsibility through strict regulation, and strict regulation would mean no bonuses, low prices, long time between draw, less existing games. Well, this kind of responsibility leads to less economic attraction. Which again will lead to growth in unregulated grey market. You follow? That's the way of thinking. But keep in mind, consumers are changing. They want more social responsibility, and perhaps can increased social responsibility also in gambling lead to happier customers. How many young players do you see outside here in the casino? What is the average player in the casino outside here? That's quite a good sign of what it goes, because millennials and those who are a bit older than millennials, they want to sit in a chair behind a slot machine and push this button. If you use the same graphics when you talk about the social responsible business model and online gambling, modern consumers' social responsibility business model leads to an increase in economic attraction and a decrease in the grey market. There's a question mark here. Cultural differences. Is this a Norwegian phenomena? One thing is certain, what affects the customer will also affect the decision makers. And I'm very excited if the gaming industry from now really will take the new knowledge. I showed this Cone research saying that 84% of the global, they want those values when they buy their products. This will be interesting to follow as far as from my point of view. So how attractive games do Norway have to offer to create revenue inside a responsible framework? Well, this is Norsk Tipping's online casino games, some of them. Some of the most popular games. And the Norwegian Gaming Authority saw indications on an increased gambling problems, which made it even more important to offer responsible online casino games. Because Norwegians, some years ago, when they should go online, they had to go outside Norway to play online. They played on the internet outside Norway. So Norsk Tipping developed these games, and in 2014 they were online. And these games are regulated in a way to find the correct balance between attractiveness